We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self-development and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change with Gunter. Welcome everybody, this is Inspired Change with Gunter. I'm your host, and let me give you a hearty welcome to this particular podcast. If you've been following the season so far, you've probably noticed me mentioning a particular word without quite finalising it or bringing it into the podcast. You would have heard it in the last episode when I said under rage is often fear or grief. You would have also heard it in the resentment episode when I said grief is what resentment guards against. And you heard it in the humiliation episode when I described what boys learn to suppress early. And you heard it in the competence episode as the thing men avoid by staying productive. Now that word is grief. And I want to talk to that directly today. And let me be clear, this is not about depression. It's not about clinical loss. I essentially want to talk about the ordinary grief that men carry throughout their lives and why that build-up, especially their ability or inability to process it, lies at the heart of so much of what we've been discussing all season. And the issue is what men don't mourn doesn't disappear. It relocates. So I want to anchor this particular session in the real tension because grief isn't about an abstract problem. We're experiencing a time of significant collective loss. There's a loss of trust in institutions, there's a loss of predictable futures, and the loss of social cohesion in communities that once brought people together. For many men, there are also personal losses beneath the public ones. Fathers who were emotionally absent, friendships quietly dissolving, marriages strained and breaking up, careers that are unfulfilling, that haven't lived up to the person's expectation, and selves never fully realised. And the cultural advice for men during all of this is consistent. Essentially, it's just keep moving, stay functional, don't dramatise it, and channel it into something productive. So it's the get on with it motto. Now, while that advice has certain social benefits, societies do not need people who can stay steady under pressure. End new paragraph. This is an edit. While that advice has social benefits, societies do need people who can stay steady under pressure. It also carries a psychological cost that I want to name today: a backlog. Many men are carrying a grief backpack. Not a large one, but years of smaller losses, disappointments, and surrendered hopes, and unacknowledged endings that were never given their due. That backlog doesn't sit quietly. The backpack doesn't empty itself out. It does shape mood, however. It shapes reactivity, it shapes relationships, and most importantly, the quality of a man's inner life, often in ways we can't really easily explain, because he cannot trace the shape of what he has never let himself feel. The social environment worsens this situation, obviously. As I mentioned in the last episode, ongoing threat and distrust are key conditions that strengthen the patriarchal authoritarian bargain. And this bargain, as I've outlined throughout this season, is explicit in banning grief. It allows anger. It allows cynicism. It allows contempt, but it equates grief with vulnerability, and therefore grief is seen as the one emotion that shatters the illusion of invulnerability. So the world is generating loss at scale, and the inner rule book is still refusing to process the contract. And that's the situation that we're navigating. So you might want to ask, well, what is grief actually? So let me start with a clinical description, because the word grief is both overused and underspecified. Grief is the psychological process of adjusting to a reality that no longer matches what you needed, expected, or loved. You see, it's not just about death. It's about any significant loss. The loss of a relationship, the loss of a version of yourself that you thought you knew, a future that you relied on, a parent who was never emotionally available, or a friendship that faded, or a life stage that passed without proper acknowledgement. I'll give you an example: the empty nest for people whose children are leaving the home. Now, what distinguishes grief from sadness is that grief involves reorganizing meaning. When you lose something important, the map of your life needs to be redrawn. You need to ask the question, who am I now? What do I do with the investment I made in that relationship, that version of myself, that hope? How do I carry what was valuable about what I lost without being owned by the loss? So grief, when it's allowed to move, does something specific. It metabolizes. It integrates the loss into the self without collapsing the self. The grief process is not about forgetting or just getting over it. It's actually about a process of digesting it. When grief isn't allowed to move, when it is suppressed, bypassed, or denied, or possibly converted into something else, it doesn't metabolize, it calcifies. It becomes part of the psyche's infrastructure, a sort of shape-shifting into states that are merely socially acceptable but no less painful. So you might want to ask the question, well, why are men especially trained to stay away from grief? And this is where the masculine introject becomes clinically central. And in a way, it doesn't need to be just clinical, okay? So Again, let me emphasize, my podcasts and the exercises are not therapy. They're exploration, right? If you need to take this up further with a therapist, please let me encourage you to do so. It's always useful. So let me come back to the masculine interject. I want to be precise about how it operates here. The interject, as I've described it across the season, is the internalized rule book of a culture that equates masculine worth with invulnerability. It says, in effect, the man who needs comfort has failed. A man who mourns has lost ground. A man who breaks open can be exploited. And I see this in men. Often, it doesn't necessarily need to be a partner's death, but a partner's moving on. They leave the relationship. And the thing that I hear in that relationship breakup, the man's response is, I have failed. With a lot of men whose partners died, they collapse. They feel abandoned. And they often struggle to find the resources to metabolize the grief, because culture says that makes us weak. So that rule actually doesn't create hard men. What it does is it creates defended men. There's a difference, and it matters in practice a lot. A hard man can take a blow and absorb it. A defended man cannot take a blow without it threatening his entire identity, because his identity is the performance of not needing anything. So grief becomes not just a feeling to be avoided, but an existential threat. To grieve, in the logic of the interject, is to admit that something mattered, and admitting that something mattered is to admit that you can be hurt. And admitting that you can be hurt in a patriarchal moral economy is to confess weakness. Boys learn this really, really early, particularly from an instruction to stop crying, to suck it up. They learn it from the peer group's mockery of visible defenses. The call, he's just a crybaby. They also learn it from fathers who were themselves trained into this refusal of acknowledging vulnerability. They may have communicated that, not always in words, but that visible loss was undignified. They also learn it from the sport culture that celebrates getting back up and apologize, needing time to fall apart. One of the reasons why a lot of top athletes, actually end up feeling depressed. It is a process of loss unmetabolized. So what this produces developmentally is a particular kind of emotional bypassing, not resilience. Genuine resilience requires the capacity to feel and to recover. Even the Stoics, if you read Meditations, Marcus Aurelius makes that very, very clear, fairly early on in his book, The Meditations. Genuine resilience, as I said, requires the capacity to feel and to recover. There's a process of repair in it. But the capacity to keep functioning while the unprocessed material accumulates beneath the surface is challenging. So in my framework, the Making Good Men Great framework, I map the mind across 3 levels to get an operational process going. I talk about the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious layers. Most grief in men socialized into the interject never reaches the conscious layer with any real sort of residency. It can't get traction in the conscious mind very well. Often, mostly, it's intercepted by the subconscious, transformed and expressed in a very different way. So let me describe that conversion because it's actually quite predictable. Grief often manifests as anger. This is the most common way people process loss. The loss itself is real, but the primary emotion is too vulnerable, so the mind shifts into something that feels stronger. Okay? It was one of the things that I picked up in the Kubler-Ross model of that, the 5 stages of grief, where, essentially, is anger necessary? And the answer is actually yes and no. It's an and also, but it's about how we understand that makes the difference. So as men, you don't cry at the funeral. Instead, you get furious at the funeral director or, the fact that parking was impossible. You don't mourn the end of the marriage. You become righteously certain about who was at fault. Anger, even if it's disproportionate or misdirected, feels more manageable than grief because it externalizes. There's no internal work necessarily going on for the metabolism, for the integration. It essentially gives you something to focus on. Now, there is the situation where grief, converted into contempt, is the social version. When the loss touches your status, a failure, a humiliation, like being passed over, being left out, the psyche can transform the pain into looking down on whoever or whatever caused it. Contempt says, I didn't lose something valuable. What I lost was beneath me anyway. It's a rationalization. This conversion is especially common in the manosphere dynamic that I described in episode 2 of the season. Grief turns into overfunctioning. What the loss involves, let me put it another way. When the loss involves someone else, like a parent, a partner, or a friend, some men respond by becoming more productive and competent. Because in that context, they see the competence as reflective of shoring up their sense of worth. So they're avoiding the collapse. So they build, achieve, and deliver. From what appears from the outside as an ambition can often be from the inside a way of running from the grief that would emerge in stillness. And I can relate to this personally. A lot of people ask me, why am I doing uni? Why am I going back into research, to do a master's and then hopefully potentially a PhD, surely at my age? Now, I have to admit that, when I did my work around this, that yes, I have a lot to share and I want to get it consolidated, acknowledged and validated within my professional system, academia. But as a result of a sort of what I saw at the time, potential brush with mortality, my way of dealing with my sort of ruptured sense of invulnerability was to get productive. Now, both are legitimate. It's not an either or. But I had to acknowledge and I had to process that issue about, over-functioning in a way. My wife still chips me about the fact that, you're taking too much on. And she has a point. There's no question about that. I have to acknowledge that. So it's not really, in a way, ambition. But it, in my case, wasn't running away from grief. It was a way of processing it in a different way, in a healthier way. Because I acknowledged it, I validated it consciously. It was allowed, to come into my conscious mind and not get stuck in the subconscious. Grief turns into numbness, and this is the shutdown mode. When the build-up becomes too much or when a single loss is simply too hard to process while moving forward, the system shifts into low-impact mode. Not peace, not acceptance, but a flatness, an absence of response that shields the person from the deepest pain but also keeps them from feeling joy, intimacy, and true engagement. It's a sort of quasi-natural antidepressant, which also blocks out all of this. It's one of the reasons why, in many respects, I perceive from where I sit as a psychotherapist that antidepressants, when a person is grieving, is actually inappropriate unless they're severely impacted. What all of these conversions share is the same logic. Grief cannot be born on its own, so it's transformed into something the introject can accept. In other words, no conflict. Now, the task, either clinically or in your own sort of revision of your growth, is not to force men into grief, but rather it's to create the conditions under which grief can be born, can be felt, and to help men understand that the conversion cost to them is in fact worthwhile. There needs to be that process of working through the pain, the metabolizing, as I put it. Now, I want to pull back and make a claim that may sound rather large, but I think the evidence supports it. Cultures that collectively cannot grieve tend towards authoritarianism. Now, serious academics out there, anthropologists, sociologists, and so on, might want to challenge me, including psychologists. But I've thought long and hard about this because the relationship between the micro to the macro is fascinating to me, and I want to understand, and I've always wanted to understand this much better. Now, I'm going to stress that this is not a rhetorical claim. It follows the same logic I've been developing across the individual. When collective loss, economic, cultural, geopolitical, cannot be held and processed within trusted institutions and shared meaning making, it converts. And it converts into grievances, into blame, into the demand for a simple enemy story that explains the pain without requiring the dignity of sitting with it. The historian and trauma theorist Vamik Volkan has documented what he calls chosen trauma, the way large groups can transmit unprocessed historical loss across generations, not as a conscious memory, but as identity fuel. The chosen trauma becomes the permission structure for retributive certainty. We lost something, they are the reason we need, and what we need is not grief, but victory. Now, I can point to quite a number of current examples where this absolutely fits. If you think about it, I'm not going to name it in this because I don't want this to be a political diatribe, but think about it. Think about what is going on right here and now in some of the, biggest issues that we're facing geopolitically. So when I look at the political landscapes described in the last episode, democratic backsliding, polarization, or the normalization of contempt, I see in part the social signature of collective grief that has been refused and converted. The rage is real, the humiliation is real, the loss of meaningful futures is real for many people. And what's not happening is the processing. We just are given more of the same. We just keep going round and round. And this is why, in many respects, history has a tendency to repeat itself. So this is where the individual and the collective meet directly. Men who have been trained by the masculine introject to refuse their own grief are the same men most susceptible to the authoritarian conversion. Not because they're weak, but because they are denied the emotional tools that would allow them to hold loss as loss rather than as provocation. A man who can grieve can say, "This matters to me, and I'm sad about it." That sentence is an act of psychological sovereignty, of autonomy, and of agency. It locates him as the person with the feeling, rather than as the object of an injustice requiring a response. A man who cannot grieve must convert. And the available conversions, anger, contempt, certainty, numbness, are precisely what authoritarian movements are engineered to recruit. So the permission to grieve is not just a therapeutic luxury. It is the current moment wherein I think it is a political act. And at this point, this is where I want to leave it today. There's a lot in this. We can digest this hugely, but the emphasis is, you may want to listen to this particular episode several times before you can start to maybe operationalize this. So for those of you who are following me on Patreon, remember that this episode will have a workspace wherein which you can dive more deeply into it. Now, if you go to Patreon, I want you to remember that before you start, this exercise is not designed to produce a breakdown. It's designed to help you locate and name what you are already carrying, so it has less power to run you from underneath. Now, if strong feelings arise, let them. Don't analyze them. Don't rush them. If you find yourself going numb or wanting to close the notebook, that information is worth noting, but not to stop you. And as always, if you need support, please reach out. And on that note, this is me signing off. Till next time.
On this show, we talk a lot about living with purpose, slowing down, paying attention, and being intentional about the choices we make every day. Because when we simplify the noise around us, we can better hear what really matters. Empathy, connection, and showing up as the best version of ourselves. That's why I'm genuinely pleased to welcome our newest sponsor, Distill Union. Their philosophy aligns beautifully with what we do here. Distill Union creates slick, thoughtfully designed essentials. Wallets, key organizers, phone cases, all built with a less is more approach. Their Wally wallets, Ferris key organizers, these are everyday tools that make life easier, cleaner, and calmer. In that simplicity, there's space for clarity. There's space for change. As a thank you to our Inspire Change community, they're offering 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. Have a look, try them out, and see how simplifying your day can open the door to something deeper. Visit distillunion.com and enjoy 20% off any product with the promo code Inspire Change. That's distillunion.com with promo code Inspire Change to check out.
Hello to all our listeners. We thank you for tuning in and supporting positive social change. This makes you a part of Gunter's efforts in transforming not only men's lives, but lives in general, and we are grateful you have joined us. This week, we would like to share our gratitude with our listeners from Armenia, who for the first time ever made it to our top 10 global listeners list at number 10. Congratulations! We thank you so much for your continued support, and we appreciate your efforts toward positive social change. I, Devonna Prinzi, the co-executive producer, and our showrunner, Miranda Spigner-Sapone, sincerely thank you and ask that you please take the time to like, follow, subscribe, and share, as your efforts make a difference to everyone here at Inspire Change with Gunter. We would love to hear from you and your stories of social change. So please remember, if you would like to share, you can reach out to the show directly. Please see the show notes for our contact information. As always, thank you to each and every one of our listeners. And most importantly, please keep inspiring positive social change.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.GunterSwoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.